People in Lebanon are picking up the pieces after nearly 14 months of war. The pause in hostilities has renewed a push to end Israel's genocide in Gaza. Could the Lebanon ceasefire agreement be a step towards broader regional peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougaida. A day after announcing the ceasefire in Lebanon, U.S. President Joe Biden said he would now be focusing on Gaza. In a post on social media, he said his administration would work again with international partners to end the war at the heart of the tension in the Middle East. Qatar and Egypt have shown willingness to join the negotiations. And Hamas has indicated it's open to discussions about an agreement that would lead to the withdrawal of Israeli troops and a real and complete prisoner exchange. But the Israeli military is relentless in its attacks across the Gaza Strip. So, will that violence derail Washington's goals? Or could the pause in hostilities in Lebanon be a sign of things to come in the region? We'll delve deeper into these questions, but first, this report from Axel Zaimovich.
In the Lebanese town of Tyre, people are returning home. The ceasefire has brought some relief to the southern border.
I'm the first person in the city of Tyre to clean my house because I have no other place to stay. So I'm forced to do this. Once I finish cleaning, even if I had to put blankets around to stay in my house, I will stay in my house. I have no other shelter, thank God. We say that as long as we are safe.
While many in Lebanon are celebrating, in Gaza, the bombardment continues, unabated. And while the Israeli military targets schools, hospitals and shelters, regional powers are trying to broker peace.
We discussed the truce agreement in Lebanon, and we express our hope that this agreement will result in a real ceasefire, and also its effect will extend to the Gaza Strip, ending this human suffering as soon as possible.
We talked about the sincere and tireless Egyptian-Qatari efforts that continued for more than a year in order to quickly reach a deal that would guarantee an immediate ceasefire and stop the bloodshed of the brotherly Palestinian people, with the release of all hostages and a number of Palestinian prisoners.
The ceasefire in Lebanon marks the end of 14 months of hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah. For Gaza, it may mean more intense fighting ahead.
Gaza now is left alone. So the Israelis will have all time and resources to fight the Gazans.
Hamas says it respects Hezbollah's decision, but its own attempts to secure a truce have stalled. Inside Israel, deep political divisions hinder peace efforts. Right-wing ministers are pushing for permanent changes in Gaza, including controversial resettlement plans.
When it comes to Gaza, the Israeli government itself is unanimously want to continue the war for different reasons. It's not because they want to achieve victory in Gaza. It's because they want to use the war in order to achieve political aims within the Israeli society.
The last pause in fighting was in November last year. It saw Hamas release 105 Israeli captives. That week-long respite remains the only successful truce of the war. But Palestinians are still hoping for a breakthrough.
God willing, a similar truce will happen here as well, because our people are suffering. Everyone is living in torn tents, without food, and completely deprived of the basic necessities of life.
But with Israeli ground and air operations intensifying and the humanitarian crisis deepening, that breakthrough seems increasingly distant. Axel Zaimovich, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Paris, we have Nadim Houri, who's the executive director of the Arab Reform Initiative and a Lebanese human rights lawyer. In Tehran is Professor Mohammad Marandi, who's a professor at the University of Tehran. He also advised the Iranian team during international negotiations that reached a landmark deal on the country's nuclear program. And over in Washington, D.C., we have Akbar Shahid Ahmad, who's the senior diplomatic correspondent at the HuffPost. He's writing a book about Gaza and the Biden administration as well. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for your time. Professor Marandi, the big question now is, where does this leave the situation in Gaza? Do you believe that there is real momentum now to get a ceasefire in Gaza, and by whom?
It remains to be seen. The Israeli regime has an army that's exhausted, and the international community is outraged. Across the globe, the Israelis are despised in a way in which I've never seen before. But of course, the real issue is what Netanyahu wants, and Netanyahu needs the war to continue for his own personal benefit. He is fearful of being sidelined and then taken to jail for corruption charges. But Trump, as we've heard, wants this to end before he comes to power. And Biden may have his own calculations. It is possible that people in the Biden team would like to see this come to an end, because many in the Democratic Party feel that Netanyahu did have something to do with their defeat in the election. So
Right.
While they are pro-Israeli, but they may not be so much pro-Netanyahu.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you, Professor Marandi, because when Biden says that his administration would, quote, make another push for a Gaza ceasefire, look, for people in Gaza, obviously that ceasefire can't come soon enough. But I suppose the question is still, why is Biden saying this now?
Again, I don't know what's going on in the White House, but if there is an incentive for Netanyahu, for Biden to impose a ceasefire, in my opinion, it has more to do with their dislike, his dislike, and the people around him for their dislike of Netanyahu. They support the Israeli regime, but they do blame, many do blame Netanyahu for the failure of Harris and for the failure of the Democrats in the House and in the Senate. And again, there's also the issue of Trump. Netanyahu knows that Trump wants this to end to go before he comes to power. So there could be both the Biden team and the Trump team pushing for a ceasefire for different reasons. And the pressure on the Israeli regime continues. The ceasefire is not clear if it will last. Hezbollah is definitely preparing itself for a potential next phase. And Yemen and Iraq and elsewhere will continue. And Iran will carry out its retaliation for the Israeli airstrike on Iran. So there is still a lot going on.
Right. Okay. We'll come to these points in a moment, but let me bring in Nadim Houri. Nadim Houri, you wrote on X, with the announced ceasefire for Lebanon, it's important to remember Gaza. We need renewed momentum for an immediate ceasefire. So what will you be looking out for that suggests to you that there is indeed an honest, renewed commitment to get a ceasefire in Gaza?
Look, I will be looking to see if some of the additional players, I mean, clearly the key player is the U.S., but I agree with Professor just before me. We don't really know how serious the U.S. is and how much leverage they're willing to use. But will it create a momentum? And will that momentum bring in additional players, potentially Arab Gulf states like Saudi and others, to make a bigger push to have a ceasefire in Gaza? There could also be a dynamic within Israel itself. If the Israelis particularly feel that the ceasefire with Lebanon allows Israelis to return back to the north, we might see a domestic push again for a deal with Gaza to release the hostages. So there will be a bit of an oxygen sort of and space to kind of create new momentum, which may corner Netanyahu. But really, the main ball is in the U.S. court right now.
That's the thing. I mean, for Netanyahu himself, and as Professor Marandi was saying a moment ago, if he goes for a ceasefire in Gaza, then he's going to lose his government pretty much.
That's possible. I mean, and that's definitely a calculation. But Netanyahu is also a political animal. So, is there another deal within Israeli domestic politics that would allow him to do that? He's feeling emboldened by the fact that Trump won the elections. So he may have some leverage vis-a-vis other Israeli domestic actors from the center and even parts of the left. So I don't know. I mean, many of us, myself included, wrote off Netanyahu in the past, and unfortunately, he is still there. But I agree. I mean, he's clearly not a peacemaker, right? And his current government and himself are pushing not only continue the war, but to actually settle parts of Gaza. So it will require a major change this calculation. But we're living in very uncertain times. So I'm still hopeful that perhaps we could see a momentum where, as well, this sort of deadly, diabolical dynamic currently dominating political decision-making in Israel starts shifting calculus if they see some benefit to the ceasefire with Lebanon.
Akbar Ahmad, you say that the Lebanon announcement has to be viewed in the context of Biden's broader policy. How so?
So I think we need to understand this conflict through the Biden team and their sense of their own legacy, right? So I talked to a lot of folks at the White House, folks across the Democratic Party. President Biden very much sees himself as a foreign policy expert par excellence. I think that's difficult for international audiences to understand, given the level of death and destruction on his watch, often with the US implicated. But that's really how he understands himself. And that's how his team plans to pitch themselves going forward. These are people whose careers are not over. So for them, what they've really seen, Doreen, is they have supported Israel to a huge degree, really in an unprecedented way that even former presidents from both parties have not. As civilian casualties have mounted, Biden has said, I will continue weapons to Israel. In fact, just simultaneously with the Lebanon ceasefire deal, the administration revealed another $700 million Israeli weapons sale. So I think we need to see it in the context of Biden permitting Israel to go into Lebanon, to cross one of his red lines. He had previously said, I don't want to see a war in Lebanon. He did permit that to happen. He did allow hundreds of civilians, if not thousands, to be killed with US weaponry, as we know, by the Israelis. And I think while he's certainly trotting out the ceasefire agreement as a legacy achievement, and fingers crossed it will last and save human lives, I think we have to see it in the context of huge displacement of Lebanese. We have to see it in the context of empowering Netanyahu and kind of sending a message that a military-first strategy and a strategy that does not have a kind of sense of accountability for actions is acceptable. And simultaneously, we have to read it in the context of this is not an agreement that is a years-long or even multiple months-long agreement. It's a 60-day ceasefire. So what we've seen President Biden do is say, try to figure out your issues within this period. We haven't seen him yet, as the other guest mentioned, use American leverage in a meaningful way to ensure that. There is no trigger in this deal. If we think about other diplomatic agreements, whether it's the Iran nuclear deal that Professor Morandi was involved in, other agreements, there are kind of, if you don't do this, here's what will happen. We haven't seen that from the US yet, right? And I think in the remainder of the Biden administration, we're still extremely unlikely to see the US use its actual leverage in terms of weapons and diplomatic support for Israel to enforce a ceasefire in either Lebanon or Gaza.
Look, Akbar, I mean, help some of our international viewers understand this, who might be scratching their heads at this point, saying, look, the Biden administration now seems to be pushing for a deal when it comes to Gaza, and Biden is touting this Lebanon ceasefire agreement as sort of monumental. But at the same time, and you were just mentioning this, at the same time, Biden announced a $680 million arms package to Israel. So how does that work? And for Israel, does it have any incentive at all to stop the Gaza war when it's constantly supplied with weapons by the U.S.?
So I do think it's hard for people to understand it, and I completely get that. I think to think about it from the US political context, the Biden administration sees themselves as closer friends with Israel, better allies to Israel than any other administration in history. That is how they want to go down and how President Biden wants to go down in history. And I think that's where you see this continued weapons supply. I think that's where you see the Biden team talk about ceasefires, talk about civilian casualties, talk about their concerns, but stick to the same playbook that they have had throughout this conflict. And what we know about that playbook is it's a playbook that's allowed, again, huge displacement, huge allegations of war crimes, and a policy that many would argue, many supporters of Israel, even among the Democratic Party and Biden circles, would say, is this beneficial for even Israel in the long term? Right? The prime minister is now under an arrest warrant. Their former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, is under an arrest warrant. But that's kind of how the Biden administration see themselves. They've picked a strategy very much from the onset of the war. Biden drew a clear line against in any way stopping the supply of American weaponry to Israel. I don't see that shifting. I do think they're very committed to this idea of an Israel-Saudi-US deal, which we can talk about a bit more. I think that's very much what I'm going to see them fixate in these last 2 months. But to your point about does that shift the Israelis in any way, Prime Minister Netanyahu effectively campaigned for Donald Trump, right? He didn't outright say it, but he came to Washington. I was in the room when Netanyahu was in the halls of Congress, right? He came to Washington, supported Biden, but was kind of clear that he was aligning himself with the Republican Party with the expectation of the Trump administration.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the point you made about the Israeli-Saudi-US deal in a moment. But first, let's just go back to Professor Morandi. When it comes to Trump, what do you think his approach is going to be to the Gaza war? And because there also seems to be, Professor Morandi, very real objectives by some of the settlers in Israel to resettle Gaza. And there is a belief that they themselves are waiting for Trump to get into power.
Trump has surrounded himself with Israeli firsters. And the statements that we're hearing, whether it's about Ukraine or about Palestine, reflect that. So I don't think there's any reason to be optimistic about Trump whatsoever. Some do believe that maybe Trump will use these people around him as bad cops and he'll behave differently. That's not impossible, but I find that highly unlikely given his past record as well. But I think the most important issue for me is that the only reason why a ceasefire happened in Lebanon was because the Israelis were being humiliated. They couldn't take southern Lebanon. And if they had gone further into Lebanon, then the ambushes would have become more severe. The casualties would have grown much higher because that's what Hezbollah had prepared itself for. So Lebanon, all they could do was massacre people and slaughter people, kill thousands of people. Most of the people who died in their homes or in the homes of other people who took them in, and mostly communities that were supporting the resistance or were targeted. But Gaza, I think, is different because Gaza doesn't have the power of Hezbollah. Of course, Hezbollah had the disadvantage that Western embassies in Beirut were conspiring against it. Western NGOs were conspiring against it. And groups that were allied to Israel during the 1982 war, people like Samuel Jaja and others who were involved in the Sabra and Shatila massacre, killing 3,500 Palestinians and Lebanese Shias, these people were conspiring with Western embassies against them. So they had to watch their back. They had that difficulty, but they were a powerful force in the South. Gaza is very different, even though Hamas and Islamic Jihad have been very heroic, but we've seen what's happened to them over the last 14 months. And I don't think that the United States has any incentive to help the people of Gaza. They right. couldn't care less. But I do think that the only thing that could be an incentive for Biden is what I said, perhaps and his team, a personal dislike for Netanyahu. And in the case of Trump, his incentive is that he wants a clean slate because he has two key objectives in the United States. One is to deal with the deep state, the FBI, the CIA, and all those people who are against him. And of course, the economic issue, which is approaching crisis point. And to have Ukraine or West Asia as a growing crisis, I think is something that will prevent him from any chance of success.
Okay, let me bring in Nadim Houri. On the subject of Hezbollah and the resistance movements, I mean, by accepting the cessation of hostilities as being described, based obviously on Resolution 1701, what do you think Hezbollah's strategic calculation was when it comes to the continued support of the Palestinian resistance?
Look, I mean, for me, it's clear the ceasefire agreement separates, perhaps permanently, the Lebanese file from the Palestinian file, if you read it on its own terms. I think I don't see any room for maneuvering for Hezbollah anymore under the ceasefire, under 1701 as enforced. And I have to say, a majority of Lebanese want to see this dissociation. So there's a huge level of support and empathy for Palestinians, but the vast majority of Lebanese did not want to get militarily involved. Hezbollah did it. Hezbollah was the most powerful actor, particularly under Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. The Lebanese didn't have much of a say in it. Part of the big argument of Hezbollah was, I've got discovered, basically saying, I've established a form of mutual deterrence with Israel. That deterrence seemed to hold unequally, but seemed to hold for about 10 or 11 months. And suddenly in September, it didn't. And so I think today, by the terms of the agreement, the Hezbollah doesn't have much of a leeway to continue supporting Hamas or the resistance in Palestine militarily.
Professor Marandi, actually, let me bring in Akbar Ahmad, because I see you wanted to say something to this.
Well, I do think it's important to see, as Nadim was pointing out, that Hezbollah is strategically weakened, right? It does need to rebuild. And I think that's where we are looking at a longer term scenario here, where a question of, can the Lebanese state kind of stand up greater institutions? Will the US support the Lebanese military? Will it kind of stop the Israelis from striking them as they repeatedly have done? I think these are the kind of open questions. And I think that speaks to a bigger question with the Trump administration, where he is surrounded by Iran hawks. He is surrounded by people who are ardently pro-Israel. And I think that's it's not going to necessarily box him in, but I think there's a question of how many fights does he want to pick? I mean, Trump does want to do a huge economic restructuring in the US, he claims. He wants to take on the federal bureaucracy and kind of weaken these institutions from within, weaken any guardrails against his own power. Simultaneously, does he feel he wants to take on people who don't want him to be more conciliatory towards Iran or towards other factors in the region? Does he want to take on people who are really skeptical of any investment in Lebanon and the Middle East?
Okay,
so I think
let's bring in. Okay, on the subject of Iran, Professor Marandi, I mean, this deal comes, of course, as the incoming U.S. administration, Trump, could have a more hawkish position on Iran and its allies in the region. But you also have a new Iranian president, and now you have a new U.S. administration. So could the Lebanon ceasefire then be a first step, perhaps, to Tehran building some sort of dialogue with the Trump White House, or not?
If that means that Iran would relinquish its support for Palestinians and for Hezbollah and for Hamas, Islamic Jihad and Ansarullah, no, that's not going to happen. And if it means that the United States wants to ease tensions so that energy supplies from the Persian Gulf can continue, then that is, of course, something that can be discussed. If it's about the nuclear program, as long as Iran's sovereignty and its rights are preserved and Iran's peaceful nuclear program is preserved, that can be discussed as well. But there are a number of issues. One is that Trump in the past has shown himself to be unpredictable. The United States in general is a country that does not abide by its commitments. It signs a piece of paper, and when it feels it's unnecessarily, it just throws it away and does something else. In that sense, the Israelis and the Americans are more or less the same. And in fact, I would argue that the ceasefire in southern Lebanon doesn't necessarily end anything, because it could collapse anytime. It would depend on the whims of people in Tel Aviv and especially Netanyahu.
Okay.
But
let me jump in here for the sake of time. My apologies,
great expectations.
My apologies, Professor Marandi. For the sake of time, Akbar, one question to you, and then Nadim Houri, a final thought from you. Akbar, on the issue of the Saudi-Israel U.S. deal you were mentioning earlier. Tell us what you've been learning about that from where you are in Washington.
Absolutely. I think there's a real desire in the Biden administration to get some kind of US-Saudi commitment. They're very much looking at this in the context of wanting to not only have a legacy achievement, but kind of lock in Saudi. They've always thought of this as a way to keep Russia and China out of the Middle East, kind of align Saudi, align other countries against Iran. I think while there's a real determination by Iran and its allies not to give up all their influence, they are on the back foot in this moment, right? And I think the US will be making the case of Hezbollah is weakened. The Israelis seem to a degree to have kind of been ascendant. And I think that's the argument they're going to be making. I don't know if the Saudis will necessarily buy that. You've seen them be more conciliatory, but that's the argument the US is going to make.
Okay, yeah. Professor Marandi, respond in 30 seconds, and then Nadeem Houri, final thought to you.
I think it's the other way around. I think the West is much weaker than it was in 2016, and so is the United States. The Israeli regime is much weaker. It is globally isolated. The ICC has issued arrest warrants. We live in a very different world from 2016, and I think Trump will find out the hard way. Everyone has been weakened by war, but I think the West has been weakened more than anyone else, especially because it has conflicts going on in Ukraine and with China as well.
Nadeem, a final thought from you on, we've been discussing what this means for Gaza as well as the region, but what about for Lebanon's political climate? This cessation of hostilities is now in place. We'll see if it holds, but we also know that the Speaker, Nabih Berri, has called a parliament session to elect a president on January 9th. So what does this mean for Lebanon?
Sure. Very briefly, look, Lebanon is at a crossroads, and there are really two paths. One is the country was already very, very weak, very divided more than a year ago, and it even got more divided now. So we have two options. Either the ceasefire unblocks the political dynamic in the country, allows for the election of a president that is able to bring all the parties, including Hezbollah, to have a meaningful conversation about pressing the reset button and bringing Hezbollah into the fold of the state, but not just bringing Hezbollah into the fold of the state, letting the Lebanese get on with the reforms that they need to do and that they've wanted to do since 2019 to build actually a proper state. That would be the ideal path. It's going to be hard because we have a long to-do list from rebuilding the country, dealing with the bankruptcy across the country, supporting the army, deploying the army, helping the displaced, the wounded, the families who've lost their main breadwinners. The other path is we continue in this sort of situation where everyone is blocked. Hezbollah is weakened, but is not completely out of the equation. He's still he's still the major political player. Does Hezbollah want to join the rest of the Lebanese in building a Lebanese state? Or will it continue in its previous posture of being a state within a state that wants to retain the decision of when we go to war, when we have peace, to retain a veto on who should be the president, and preventing the Lebanese state of being present in the south? I think this is a real, fundamentally almost existential question for Lebanon today. The ceasefire gives us some breathing space to maybe look each other in the eye and start these difficult conversations.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Nadeem Houri, Mohammed Marandi, and Akbar Shahid Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.